Thank you very much, Paolo. It's a pleasure to be here. It has been a great conference. And thanks also for this invitation to interview Kai-Uwe, which I gladly accepted because I've always dreamt to be a journalist, and finally I had this possibility. So, well, obviously I thought of being very, sharp and provocative, etc. But now I heard that there are people who want to know whether I'm going to follow along the same lines of Kai-Uwe or not, and they try to extrapolate from the questions of what I might want to do in the future. Well, from that point of view, I guess that there will be some continuity. Just to give you a little bit of a background, Kai-Uwe and I have known each other for more than 20 years. And our first course that we have actually received, in which we were taught about antitrust, was by John Sutton at the London School of Economics. So that, I guess, at least in my case, but probably also in Kai-Uwe's case, was the first exposure to antitrust issues. And then we have taught our first competition policy course together in Barcelona. So we were in the same room, deciding what to teach and how to organize our classes. So, and in particular, I must say that my way of thinking about competition policy has been shaped a lot by Kai-Uwe. And so, from that point of view, I guess you will see in the future a little bit of continuity at least. So I'm here to learn about mergers and Kai-Uwe's views about mergers. I will refrain from asking personal questions and how I should organize the furniture in the office, not to say the meetings. So let me start also with something which is a little bit more general and perhaps slightly provocative, which is, are we perhaps not strict enough with horizontal mergers? So let me explain a little bit what I mean by that. So I'm teaching my students, and we are teaching students in general, that when you have horizontal mergers, these horizontal mergers are increasing market power unless you have efficiency gains. And then if the industry is very concentrated, you need quite a lot of efficiency gains in order to balance this market power effect. So from the point of view of theory, the a priori, without knowing anything, it should be that, the mergers, unless you really have lots of efficiency gains, are not necessarily welfare beneficial. That's from the theory point of view. On the empirical side, we start to see some literature on, which is, on merger retrospectives, as John Quokka, for instance, calls them, or ex post assessments, which is probably the way in which we would call them in Europe, which points to the fact that there are lots of mergers which are being cleared by the agencies. At least in the US, we have some evidence about that, this meta-analysis that John Quokka is doing, that these mergers are, which are accepted turn out to be increasing prices. And today also we have seen some evidence also from the work of the Federal Trade Commission, which was presented by Daniel Hosken. So the first question is, so are we doing right with mergers, or perhaps are we been too lax?
Well, I think before I answer the question, let me congratulate you on the new job. It's a great job, and possibly the greatest job in competition policy, because I think the breadth of issues that arises might be even greater than in the US agencies. So I think secondly, thanks to Paolo for organizing this, and after the story of Massimo, you now will keep wondering whether either Paolo is incredibly influential in Brussels or me, and I'll let you worry about that. Maybe neither. So I think the third thing is, in between, I suggested that I should really be interviewing Massimo, because since Wednesday, I think everybody is interested in what he thinks, not what I think. Or if they're interested in what I think, it's what I think he thinks. So you will have to listen very carefully his questions, and so I'm going to get to the question, which is, are we too soft? Bruce just talked about the Kai-Uwe effect. Was this it? Maybe we're going to see a Massimo effect. Which direction? Let me say the following. I don't actually typically like the question of saying, are we generally too tough or are we generally too soft? I think the real question is, are we taking the right decisions? The Quokka work does concern me because it does suggest that there may be biases in the direction of being too soft under some circumstances. But the Quokka work also suggests that we're getting the intervention rate just about right, but that we might have to think very hard about being right on remedies, and maybe in some circumstances that we might have to go all the way to a prohibition where we're trying to avoid that in some other cases. But let me say what I think we've been trying to do, and where I think economics has been working, not so much in kind of generally saying we're too tough or not tough enough, but asking the questions, are there certain biases that might go in that direction in ways that we've treated mergers? And I think one of the biases that I saw, and where we had a recent decision that worked somewhat against this, was in the treatment of excess capacity in homogeneous goods industries. There was a fairly standard argument that went to say, look, if you have excess capacity, there are competitors out there that can expand their production in response to the merger, therefore there's no problem. And then mergers would go through. I remember one merger on which I was inflicted very early on, in which that seemed to play a role in the final decision. And in the recent Outokumpu-Inoxum merger, I think we very much made a point that just the ability to expand because of excess capacity doesn't mean that the prices aren't going up. That the consolidation of excess capacity is actually something that's very important in order to maintain market power. And in that merger, it was a merger to over 50%, both in market share and capacity. And despite the excess capacity on the other side of the market, we did some back of the envelope, in a sense. I mean, a simulation exercise that tried to work out with a lot of sensitivity analysis what the incentives would be there. And all it was suggesting was that there could still be fairly large incentives to raise prices. I think things like that are attempts to balance in the right direction. And I think the direction merger policy has gone with the greater influence of economics is that you're seeing both those cases in which we're tougher, but also other cases in which we have very high market share, and after careful analysis of the market say there's no problem. So I think the tight relationship that you've shown between market share and intervention is somewhat loosening up as we're getting more sophisticated about the analysis. And I think that should be the goal, rather than saying being tough or not so tough.
So you mentioned that at a certain point you did back of the envelope calculation, and then you corrected yourself and you said simulations. So the next question that I would like to ask you is about what has been your experience about the use of empirical methods in merger analysis. Whether this is back of the envelope calculations or simulations or whatever other instruments. So, in a word, I think what has happened in recent years clearly is that there has been an increase in the use of empirical methods in merger analysis, and the parties have clearly invested a lot into this. And they have brought into the analysis more and more sophisticated methods. The agencies have followed. So do you think that the balance of the use of empirical methods is about right? So what is your cost and benefit analysis of that? Because after a while, you might say, well, we had spent lots of time and the few resources that we had at the agencies to have structural model with full-blown simulation. And then perhaps in the end it was something that it was not necessary. Perhaps the judges would have not even understood and appreciated this work. And also, as we also learned this morning, when there was this interesting remarks that Dan Olsken made about the HHI being quite powerful as a predictor of what mergers might be going wrong or not. So what is your impression about all this?
Okay, let me start at the beginning when you said I corrected myself on back on the envelope relative to simulation. I corrected myself because I remembered we have lawyers in the room, and whenever I say back of the envelope, they say, I see you haven't done the analysis properly. And I usually use it as great praise because I think all of our methods are back of the envelope, because even if you're doing a merger simulation, it's back of the envelope because you're making very strong behavioral assumptions that we know in reality aren't right in the same way. And I think in that way, I was completely agreeing with Joe yesterday. We're typically not Bertrand or Cournot or collusion. Lots of things are in between, and so we'll only get approximations, and we're only aiming at order of magnitude issues. And so I think that's what to keep in mind very much. And the idea that there's kind of a hierarchy of simple stuff, and the pinnacle is the merger simulation, I think is the wrong way of thinking about things. What I've tended to think from a practical point of view, what we're doing in practice is that we have to see what kind of evidence is actually available in a particular case. And I think the worst case in that regard I had when I came and was asking, well, what evidence do we have in a case that was on skis? And they said, well, we've tried very hard. The only thing that we have is market shares for 1 year and aggregated. And so that was probably the poorest information situation there was, and we were very lucky they withdrew the merger. But it's a little bit, if you only have if you have some information on diversions and you have margins, well, up is a great thing to do. You don't always have that. If you have really, really good price data and you can do something with demand, do it. But it is very costly both to the firms and to the agencies. And so I think in the process, you really have to think very hard. First of all, how complicated does it look what this merger is? You have to make a cost-benefit analysis, to what extent a deep analysis makes sense or not. And so I think we're at a point where we're much more sophisticated about the techniques, in the sense that we're not saying, what's the best technique that we can use, but asking the question, here we have a set of data, what's in the toolkit that allows us to tell the most convincing story about this merger and kind of target the questions that we really want to address. And so it's not academic in the sense of saying, here's a hierarchy of things we want to do. It's really the question, let's start from the case, let's see what the issues are, where do we identify the real issues about substitution, and what's the right methodology to address that.
But have you ever felt, for instance, that there were cases in which it was not, it was not worth entering in a very sophisticated analysis, for instance, because the case was for some reason obvious, but then since the parties started to use very sophisticated methods, and you had to follow?
Yes, it's certainly you're forced, if there are sophisticated methods being used by the parties, to actually analyze that. I mean, there's no way around that. But there's several instruments that you have. I mean, one is you can avoid doing it yourself. Secondly, you can also discourage too sophisticated analysis. So I had a recent case where we had an Economist meeting and where we discussed what the data was. And we came to the conclusion that the best method to figure out what was going on was actually looking at the requests for information, asking very specific questions to the parties, because there was no hope of improving the data that we could get from bidding analysis. And I think we're getting a bit more sophisticated in trying to be early on in an interaction with the economists of the party to kind of figure out what the right framework for the analysis is in order to avoid this. We've had other cases in which we've tried to steer and where the parties haven't allowed this. And we got lots of submissions early on claims about substitutability and what was in the same market, until finally they were willing to sit down, and we kind of figured out that looking at effects directly was much more worthwhile than kind of all of that other work. I think trying to steer, I think there's a learning process on both sides, that trying to steer this, come to an agreement on the right framework for the analysis is the way forward. But I think we're in a process of learning how to fit overall the sophistication of the economics into an administrative process that actually works.
Okay, so let me switch now to another topic, which is, say, in general about innovation, investments, and efficiencies. This was one of also the questions which had been proposed by Paolo and Lear when they set up the program for this interview, which I have taken the liberty to go a little bit aside from this. So clearly there are some mergers for the characteristics of the firms or the characteristics of the industry, where to understand the way in which investments and innovations are going is crucial. And so, you know, you have this impression that it would be really key in order to understand what is the impact of the merger, to look at what is the evolution of investments, innovations, product innovations, etc. Yet, in most cases, what happens is that innovations and investments are something which are, say, effects which take place in the medium-long run, and it's something that might be very difficult to predict. Perhaps some of these effects might not even be merger-specific, so it might be very difficult to understand, you know, absent the merger or with the merger, the way in which investments and innovations are going to develop. So, in your experience, what is the importance that these sort of considerations should have in practice? And this is, you know, a little bit more generally, because it's not only about dynamic efficiency but also static efficiencies. So what is the role that efficiency gains, whether static or dynamic, have had, at least during your tenure in merger control at the Commission, in practice? And it would also be nice if you could mention one case, at least, maybe there are many more, in which efficiency gains, perhaps dynamic efficiency gains, really made a difference. So it's a very composite question.
Let me actually, I think it's most effective to start from the last question and then go back to the first. I mean, 10 years ago when I was writing about the change in the merger regulation, the proposed changes, I was very skeptical about putting efficiency gains in. I mean, we were just coming off a number of mergers where there was, you know, too much free thinking at the Commission.
He was very critical with the Commission as well.
Yes. I was very skeptical whether this was a really useful instrument, and especially about the problems of verifiability of efficiencies. Now, that problem of verifiability of efficiencies, I think, is a very central one to the discussion that happens at the Commission. But I think within the last 2 years, we've had, at least looking at it from internally, and I think not quite as noticed outside in terms of the effects, but I think in terms of policy, a fairly rapid movement. When I first came, we had some mergers in which there was a complete unwillingness to discuss the efficiencies because it was seen as too complicated to look at. the first case that I can say in which efficiencies really played a major role was Deutsche Börse and IC. And the reason was, and literally I went to the commissioner to explain to him the economics of clearing. It was very clear that in this case, you could not deny that there were economies of scale and scope in clearing that could come about through this merger. But it was the same effect that was also relevant for the barriers to entry in the area, and the same issue that was relevant for potential competition that played a central role in that context. So, as a result, the Deutsche Börse merger really became the first one in which we explicitly accepted efficiencies. Not to the extent that the parties wanted, but the clearing efficiencies we actually fully accepted. Now, the parties were talking about 3 billion in efficiencies. That was 3 billion in savings of collateral. So the issue of efficiencies was really the opportunity cost of holding that collateral, and that was 1 to 2 orders of magnitude smaller. So then the efficiencies weren't quite as dramatic anymore, and in the qualitative weighting that we did, the fact that we were essentially getting a merger to monopoly was something that then weighed stronger than a less than 100 million efficiency gain, potentially. But it was the first time that we actually went to all of the risk of saying we're recognizing these efficiencies, and because we had a clear theory why that happened, because they were calculated on the basis of a clearing model that they had, so we could see the logic of how they were generated and could see that the order of magnitude was believable. Again, back of the envelope in a sense, but quality of size. Now, that has actually led to us in other cases in which it's been much more obvious that efficiency might be important to very seriously consider them, and the UPS TNT is actually the big example. And I think one of the things that will only really come out when the decision is out is that you will see that for the first time the Commission has dropped concerns on markets, because we felt that the efficiencies on those markets were outweighing the anti-competitive effects that we had estimated there. So again, there was a weighing. It didn't go all the way in the direction of clearing the merger. There were problems in some of the areas. And the merger, the reason why it all fell through wasn't because we didn't recognize efficiencies, but it was one of these questions of how can you get a viable remedy. So I think we've made enormous progress here, but there is a problem. And the problem is that if you're going forward and if you're struggling to see what's the right standard of proof, if you ever overshoot, you can never come back. Right? So once you recognize something that they tried in the hard disk merger, where they told us, we have 250 million of efficiencies, and you say, well, what's the proof? Well, the CFO certified it. How can you deny it? That's kind of not the standard that you want. But how far do you go in that? What kind of study works? Is it sufficient to say, well, in 2006, we did a study of efficiencies, and we kind of said, well, today it may be about 40% less. Can you accept that? Even if you want to recognize them, you get problems because of the precedent that you're setting. So you have to be incremental in recognizing this and feel your way towards a standard that is sufficient, and I think that's why it's a slow process. So in that sense, I think we've made a lot of progress. Let me talk about innovation and investment. I think, first of all, as economists, we have to...
Which is more generally static versus dynamic efficiency. There was a paper by Hendrik Röder, for instance, who was saying that static efficiencies are accepted, but dynamic efficiencies, not much.
Well, I think the problem is what is our ability to empirically investigate innovation and investment. And I think we have to recall that, even estimating price effects is hard because we're always looking for the identifying variation, but there's enough happening in the market to sometimes get something that allows you to identify price effects. The structural quasi-exogenous changes that identify to you what the incentives for innovation are or the incentives for investment are much rarer. So the hope of doing something empirically there to identify how big that effect is are just not there. So you have to work completely on a qualitative basis, and then our ability to predict is much, much lower. That doesn't mean that these issues haven't played a role, and I would think, for example, in the HDD merger again, we're very seriously thinking whether there might be economies of scale coming up in that production that would actually mean that cost reductions might be faster if you'd consolidate. We tried to look at that theoretically. We kind of realized that if we were serious about racing models, actually mergers might have very bad effects, so we couldn't quite match this. But the analysis of innovation was very important in that merger. Possibly not quite in the dynamic effect that you wanted, but in a quasi-dynamic way. Namely, it was very clear that the intensity of competition depended on how close you were in innovation space, in a sense. So the guys who were kind of contributing to the frontier of innovation on hard disk drives and the technology seemed to be much closer competitors. And there was another issue that we were seeing, that there was across the board, the innovation was coming from the smaller disks to the larger ones. And so when we're thinking about the development of this market going into the future, when we're talking about divestments in 3.5-inch hard disks, we had to recognize that we couldn't just divest that. And we couldn't just divest that with the R&D and the new models that were coming up in 3.5 inches. We also had to make sure that we were divesting it to a firm that had the innovation potential, that is, the innovation program on 2.5-inch disk drives, that made it possible to actually credibly, in the long run, have an innovation program on 3.5-inch disks as well. And that, in the end, left buyer criteria that essentially pointed to Toshiba as the only possible buyer. That may not be satisfactory if you're really concerned about analyzing what dynamic effects are, but I think we have to be realistic in what we can actually do. But I think we're trying as much as we can from the qualitative analysis, and we're becoming more sophisticated in how we're taking into account the innovation effects when we're designing remedies in order to kind of secure the long run competition on the R&D side.
So I have one last set of questions, so we are going to go close to the end. And the last set of questions is to inquire a little bit about your own experience. Okay? And so I remember it was a workshop at Bocconi University a few years ago. And there was a question which was addressed to former Commissioner Mario Monti about political pressure. So the question was, had he received political pressure during his mandate as Commissioner at DG Comp, and in which area? And people would expect that the political pressure that he had received were basically from the US, and in particular were these big mergers like GE Honeywell during his mandate. And the answer that Monti gave was that yes, he did receive political pressure. I do not know whether this is something which is that I could talk openly about, but he did mention it in a workshop which was not a closed door. And he said, I did receive a lot of political pressure, but not from the US, but from some particular member states. And this in particular, he mentioned one case, which was Volvo Scania. And this brings me to, well, first, the general question is that whether EU or, in general, DG Comp has received pressure of some type. We are very few people here, so you can, there are no journalists. I'm not a journalist, I'm an academic, so you can feel free, I guess. But also more particularly, I would like to have your views about this sort of, these arguments which are reappearing which are arguments about national champions, and the Commission is not getting the market definition right because it is markets are defined too narrowly, and therefore we are not allowing to create firms which are really competitive in worldwide because we are constraining them in their national dimension.
Well, let me take this in several stages. I think the first one is there's no question that there are behind the scenes pressures from member state and member state governments that try to take influence on these processes. I think in mergers, my experience is that if you have a very clear-cut technical analysis of the merger, that will typically not prevail. I can't really think of a case in which that had a decisive influence on the transaction when I look back on our decision. That doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. It also doesn't mean that some of the political background discussion isn't very important and increases the pressure. So you can imagine, given that we have a very large telecom discussion, that if we have to make a decision in Austria,
no reference to real case, I guess.
No reference to a real case. No. I think it's just obvious that it is clear that this will be, whether it is or not, it will be taken as a signal for the policy of the Commission in such merger cases. And then you have to be very, very careful about the arguments that you're putting forward, and just, the precision with which you try to work goes up. But again, even in that case that we're referring to, I think the outcome was very much driven by the technical analysis of the merger. I also have to say, when there are mergers where, from the technical analysis, I would say, well, you could go either way. It's really a matter of assessment. I feel completely comfortable that the decision then is taken on expediency grounds by the Commissioner. If I basically can't tell, I don't know which one is worse, that's fine. And I think we had one or two decisions like that as well. Now, that doesn't mean that we're not in an environment that is changing and where the dialogue is changing. Within the Commission, I think, between different Directorate Generals and between different commissioners, issues of industrial policy are getting much more important. Pushback against merger policy is there, and kind of in those areas, the lobbying makes a big difference. But what we're seeing so far is that the arguments with which lobbying occurs at the level of the Commission generally, and the arguments that we're being confronted with in the technical analysis are so different that you have something where another DG argues, well, you're getting the market definition right, it's worldwide. And the commissioners can say in the decision meeting, but the parties themselves say the market is European, right? That's the situation we've had so far. But I think from the whole industrial policy area, the thinking will get more sophisticated. There's a buildup also of economics groups and enterprise and so on and so forth. And that topic will not go away because we don't have a dialogue these days that's about market opening up competition. It's about competitiveness and how to help European firms. And so making the argument for competition has gotten harder. And I think one has to recognize that we're working in that type of environment now, and so that looking forward, things may be changing in a way that we haven't seen before in merger policy, even in merger.
So still on your experience, any regrets? Any case that if you could go back and say, well, we got wrong? Or perhaps something like, well, it's such a pity that, I don't know, the merger guidelines or the merger regulation do not include different clauses? Or, I don't know, it's such a pity that we didn't we didn't investigate more thoroughly one case? Anything like that?
Let me, again, two parts. First part, I think you can always, first of all, you know that if you're taking these decisions, and a lot of decisions, you're going to make some wrong calls. And kind of going back and basically saying this was a wrong call, I'm not sure whether that makes sense. I think most of the time it means that you have to think whether you can have a better process and what in the process went wrong. And I think there we've been trying to work very hard on integrating economics at an earlier stage and in a better way so that we could catch issues earlier, because that's most of the time the problem. If something goes really wrong, is because we're catching the economic problems too late. And that has happened, and I would have liked it to happen less often. But you know, that's a learning process where really the institutional structure and the organization has to adapt, and we're learning and how to integrate economics. So there I don't have any regrets, because that's a normal learning process. I think in terms of frustrations on competition rules, there are quite a few. And I think just in the merger area, there are two things that I find somewhat distasteful. And they have to do with two mergers. One, the Austrian telecoms merger, in which you could structure a transaction by selling one part of the firm to Hutchinson and the other part to the number one. And we had to treat it as separate transactions. And both the Austrians, and one part was in Austria, the other with us. And we know that the overall transaction would have been analyzed as an anti-competitive transaction. But we had to work a lot harder because the incremental transaction had to be analyzed with the assumption that the other transaction took place, despite the fact that the two transactions were conditional on each other. And that's because of a jurisdictional note that sometime the legal service had written. Unfortunately, we're not resolving that in what I'm seeing. A similar issue is on the definition of mergers. So in the BMI IAG transaction, there was a part of the transaction in which IAG was giving operating capital to BMI that was burning money at a very high rate against collateral that were slots. And really in that transaction, the only thing that had value were the 45 slots at Heathrow. And they got something like, I don't know the number anymore, but something like 20 up front or 15 up front. Now, in the case of bankruptcy, which Lufthansa had said they would put them into if this would not go through in phase one, these slots would have had to stay with IAG. So the transaction changed the counterfactual for our analysis. Because slots are not associated with revenue directly, and therefore our transactions, that is not a part of the merger transaction. That's the legal position. Economically, of course, not very sensible. But there are strange legal rules of that type that are then very frustrating in that type of analysis. I think we have even more of those on the antitrust side. I think we have a real problem in terms of what we're seeing both in inconsistency and in kind of general line of where the European Court has been going in terms of economic analysis of antitrust. But I think the frustrations are coming mostly from legal constraints that limit your ability to do something sensible at times.
Okay, so we are going now to the end. And since I'm a light type of journalist, I want to end with a positive note. So anything that you are particularly proud of, or a success story that you can tell us so that we can leave the room relieved, and perhaps the next chief economist can think that maybe there is something to be done there?
I think especially in the merger area, what I'm really happy about is that we've had a number of big mergers in which everybody in the House has said the economics here was crucial. And if I have one big case after another in which the Deputy Director General stands up and says, and this is another case that shows how central economic analysis has to become to our merger decisions, and that is in Deutsche Börse, in UPS TNT, in Universal EMI. If
that starts to worry me, because it means, you know, if instead of 25 people, perhaps soon I would need 50.
You would get a lot of support in the CET for that, I think. No, but it's really in big decisions, in big cases, it has become very central. And I think the important thing is the agency is identifying with that and is identifying with this approach to analysis. And I think that's very important. In discussions with, you know, skeptical lawyers, or, you know, the German lawyers who are much more kind of in a traditionalist approach, you would have kind of the lawyers from DG Comp saying the same things as the economists from DG Comp. And I think that is, relative to 10 years ago, such a huge cultural change that has been achieved. And I think through very carefully integrating the economists into the case teams, we've really achieved that, because the teams are much more seeing as an asset than only the guys who are controlling and trying to stop others from doing what they want to do. And actually, in terms of checks and balances, there's also enormous progress, because if you always have people fighting against you, it's actually harder to get good thinking through than if people feel that it's actually helping them in the quality of their work. And I think that cultural change, I think we've pushed a little bit further in the last 2 years.
Thank you very much. It has really been a pleasure. I am the last speaker, so I would like to take the opportunity to thank Paolo and all the people at Lear for having organized this splendid conference. Thank you very much. I would also like to take the opportunity to thank the staff and the interpreters and the crew for all the work that they have done and for organizing impeccably this conference. Thank you very much.